be here and present my research. My name is Jiyoung Lee, and I'm assistant professor at the University of Alabama in the Journalism and Creative Media department. And I deal with a lot of misinformation in the context of health risk. And today I would like to share some of my ongoing and my very recent research projects about misinformation and how the technological advancement have complicated this misinformation issues by creating the so-called deepfake, and how people process those all the misinformation and deepfake mainly through their emotions, so that how we can be more, do a better job to correct all those of misinformation in the context of health risk. So before I share my research projects, let me just briefly begin with talking about some of the backgrounds that we have already experienced a lot during the COVID pandemic. There has been, a lot of misinformation, right? Especially on social media about COVID-19 and COVID vaccines as well. As you can see in some of the examples that FDA says it needs until year 2076 to reveal data pertaining to Pfizer vaccine approval. And another misinformation states that Delta Airlines pilot died in flight because the second shot of COVID vaccine. And all those information was absolutely false, right? But if you can all think about why people are still believing this kind of misinformation, although it apparently seems to be false, then one of the things that we have to think about is this kind of misinformation looks like a similar format that we are seeing in official news formats, right? So like this, the first example doesn't seem to be something like, the misinformation post that has been uploaded by a lay person. It really mimics the formats of the news formats, and it really provokes our understanding that it seems to be real. It seems to be a real news. This kind of misinformation about health is not actually emerged just because of COVID, right? We have seen so much health misinformation going around about the flu shot almost every year, and other medical treatments like cancer treatments like this. Dandelion root kills 98% of cancer cells in 48 hours, which is absolutely false again. But again, a lot of misinformation like this in the context of other health related issues also tends to follow a similar format that we are seeing on the official news websites like the New York Times or the Washington Post. So this kind of mimicking the other realistic cues really confuses us to what to believe and which information is false and which information is true. One of the key point that we have to think about the effects of health misinformation is that this kind of health misinformation directly affects our health decision making, right? Our health behavior. So if people see, especially those who lack of health literacy, sees this kind of misinformation, they would be really confused whether to get vaccinated, whether to take this Dandelion route, whether to get a flu shot. So it really directly relates to our psychological well-being life and our health behavior. So I can say that misinformation, although the term fake news has emerged in 2016 when we had a presidential election at that time, it's not actually limited to all the political things, right? Health misinformation is another a huge area that all the other communication scholars should actually start to think about this issue in a very serious manner. The technological advancement like artificial intelligence have actually, made our life more easily, more convenient way, but at the same time, it has been also negatively used by creating a deepfake. I'm not sure whether you guys are familiar with the term deepfake, but just to explain a little bit about the concept, deepfake is kind of like face swapping the two different persons' faces. So if we say there is a person A and person B, and if we try to create the manipulated video that person B pretends to say something, then person A can mimic the voice of person B, and also just track some of the facial expressions that person B has. So artificial intelligence using the deep learning algorithm can automatically just capture those facial expressions and swap those two different faces. So it really creates a totally fictitious video that person B says something. And this kind of deepfake has also been applied a lot. I don't want to say like applied a lot, but it's still started to be applied a lot in the context of deepfake and the health risk as well. One of the examples that I have seen about this COVID-19 as well as this deepfake is about the Belgian premier. And this video seems to be saying that the Belgian premier links COVID-19 with the climate crisis. So what she basically says is that COVID-19 virus actually had to occur because of the climate crisis. So they had a high linkage. So it actually is totally false, but since this has actually created through the video format, a lot of people, when they first saw this, and even for those who already know the Belgian premier, they just right away tended to believe this video because they never imagined that this video has been created by the deepfake, right? This video has not been created by the artificial intelligence. So this kind of using the official sources and the phenomenon that tends to create some kind of official news sources really causes a serious issue that really complicates the efforts on how we can better counter, how we can better discern between the true and false information. Another thing that I wanted to point out in the online discourse is that it's kind of dominant by irrational thinking, right? I don't want to say that all the emotions cause irrational thinking because it really is a really dependent on which distinct emotion can cause irrational thinking or not. But just by screen capturing the very recent tweets by searching the COVID as well, we can see that a lot of like online conversations going around in social media spaces are actually talking about all the emotions, like they talk about all the statements by relying on emotions. One of the serious problem of simply relying on emotion when we talk about the very sensitive thing is that if we don't rely on the specific scientific evidence and just create all the negative feelings and all this kind of online environment, then people started to just be captured by their emotions and their kind of ability to think in a critical and analytic manner gets paralyzed, right? So they just stop thinking about and approach this issue from a scientific manner. They just started to rely on emotion and just tend to decide everything by relying on emotions. So these are just the example that I screen captured, which express the fear and anger when other just ordinary Twitter users have started to talk about the COVID. So the question I wanted to start to think is that the role of emotion, right? How does emotion play a role in dominating our online discourse and affect our health decision making by just helping or inhibiting us to process the misinformation that we are seeing in online environment? Emotion has been a very popular concept that a lot of media psychologists have dealt with because when scholars have started to understand how people process the media content, they started to just develop the dual process model theory, which I'm gonna discuss later on, by dividing into the conceptual thinking, like analytic thinking and heuristic processing. And they just tended to, just perceive the emotions as a similar concept of heuristic processing rather than the systematic processing, right? Like this previous literature has stated, like at a time when news organizations are capitalizing on post-truth, we need a better understanding of emotion and a fact that works beyond the simple opposition of rationality and emotionality that continues to over-determine our political imaginary, right? So again, kind of all the social media and digital media affordances have allowed all the misinformation spreaders and creators to post more false content, and it really provokes our emotion. They know that, you know, if they touches upon our emotion, our irrational thinking can be paralyzed. So this is kind of very attractive strategy for them. But again, like we have to think about how emotion may occur here, like in terms of fake news, and how people can, you know, how emotion can play a role in making people understand the false content and making people have better discern about the false content from the truth content. Well, in fact, emotions happen everywhere, right? Emotion happen not something that has just been emerged, you know, since social media advancement. It has actually exist from traditional media content as well. And as you can see in a lot of partisan biased news cable channels, like Fox News, CNN, whenever they talk about the very political and sensitive things, they also tend to provoke our emotions to just, you know, make people do better immerse in the content, better be immersed in the content. So this kind of emotions have actually emerged from the traditional media. It's not something that just emerged all of a sudden in social media conversations, right? So all these kind of media, from traditional media to social media and advanced media technological environment, like created by artificial intelligence, by provoking our emotion, it actually made us to be very confused about what to believe, and it really makes us have a complicated problem about how we can better discern about the fake news and truth news. And the more severe issue that we are seeing in this digital media spaces is that people just don't stop by just simply consuming the fake news content, right? By having their own networks in social media, by having their Facebook friends or other Twitter followers, they tend to just post the content and talk about that issue in very, you know, just continuously, right? Constantly. So all those networks that people form when they're talking about the fake news have actually amplified, I can say, amplified the issue of this fake news, right? By forming the networks like this, or by talking about this, all the fake news with even with strangers, this kind of like the fake news content has been amplified, and it creates more and more rumors without being corrected. So this is something that we need to stop, and something that we need to think about, like about how media technological developments have caused an issue for people to amplify the fake news content, and how people started to perceive the fake news, whether relying on emotion or whether relying on cognition. So today I would like to just focus on the social media and other advanced media technological environment created by artificial intelligence rather than traditional media, based on my recent research projects. A lot of previous literature has actually talked about these two questions, right? How, when, and why do people become susceptible to misinformation? And in order to address this misinformation issue, how should cost-efficient media literacy interventions be designed? So I would like to approach these two questions from an emotional approach, and again, how other media technological advancement have caused our emotions, like have provoked our emotions in a more severe manner, so that it really affects our perceptions, our attitudes and behaviors in perceiving the fake news content. So these two questions will also be pretty much related to what I'm gonna share my recent projects as well. So the part one is about the emotional misinformation on social media. So again, I was interested in how misinformation on social media is presented from an emotional approach, and how those emotional laden misinformation can be corrected, and how those emotionally laden misinformation affects our perceptions and attitudes. So the kind of very basic question that we have to think about is whether emotions really dampen our analytic thinking, right? So like I briefly said before, dual process theory is perhaps the most one of the most popular theory that all the media psychologists are using so far. And affect heuristic, feeling as information theory, all those theories commonly say that emotion is pretty much related to our heuristic processing rather than analytic and systematic processing. So again, dual processing theory divides our perceptions into the two different factors, analytic thinking and emotional feeling, right? And when we rely on cognition in processing the content, we tend to process the content based on our analytic thinking, right? Based on our rational thinking. But when we rely on emotion based on the dual process theoretical approach, then we tend to just process the content heuristically and superficially without paying much attention. So the scholars have commonly argued that relying on analytic thinking is much, much better in understanding the content in an accurate manner. And this kind of dual processing theoretical approach has also been applied a lot in the context of misinformation literature, because scholars have argued that reliance on analytic thinking really enhances our abilities to verify the falsehood, right? And similar to this dual processing theory, other affect heuristic and feeling as information theory also commonly argues that anyway, emotions causes our heuristic processing. So if we just rely on emotions in processing the information, it anyway can create a huge problem, right? Nobody will gonna understand what the information truths are. So these are some kind of like a very traditional popular theory that most of the media psychologists have used. But recently, scholars have started to think that whether emotions really dampen our analytic thinking. So I wanted to approach this question in the context of the misinformation that we are seeing a lot on social media. So I just brought up some of the examples that I have seen so far in a lot of like social media spaces, Instagram, Facebook, and even further on the web browser extension. So whenever we see the false content, which is identified as fake by either social media platforms or other third-party news organizations, we tend to see that this information is hidden or at least have a warning label sign like this, right? Like I brought an example on the right side here. The Instagram has started to add a label which states that this is false information, which is checked by independent fact checkers, so that it actually extends its effort to prevent a lot of audiences, a lot of users to not see this false information unless they really wanted to see, right? So this is kind of like the good approach that they are taking by perceiving their responsibility of identifying the fake news. And another example that I brought below is actually from the Trusted News as a web browser extension. And whenever you guys also install this web browser extension on your browser, it can automatically identify whether the website that we are accessing is actually trustworthy or is something that is identified as fake news website. So it actually helps us to have a better media literacy abilities. And one of the other examples that I have actually borrowed for my research project is the web browser extension, which also identifies some of the misinformation as false on fake news, on Facebook. So it also states that it actually has a simple statement which states that this story comes from a source known for spreading fake news to identify this as fake. So we call this as a simple statement and simple false label. So we really wanted to start thinking about whether just identifying this misinformation as false really works, is really effective, especially when we consider that misinformation nowadays that we are seeing in social media environments is kind of laden by emotion, right? So the further question that we wanted to ask is whether this kind of emotionally laden misinformation, whenever that kind of misinformation is corrected, whether that is also effective, right? Whether that is also effective in letting people reduce their misperceptions to some extent. So those are the main questions, and having those questions in mind, let me share some of my first research projects. Here, I set up the model by identifying the different misinformation type as a fear-arousing misinformation and fear-neutral misinformation about health risk, about the fictitious health virus. And the main thing that I wanted to examine here is whether this misinformation type affects fear and risk perception, in other words, severity and susceptibility in a different way, and whether this fear and risk perception further affects misinformation credibility. The key thing I also wanted to examine here is that whether this misinformation, the effects of misinformation type on fear, risk perceptions, and furthermore to misinformation credibility can be also affected by the correction presence, right? So like I said before, I used the web add-on correction for the correction presence, and I just simply compared between the no correction condition and the web add-on correction condition. So these are the examples of the misinformation. So again, I used the fictitious health virus as a case example, and I created a Facebook post which states that an unnamed virus is spreading across the United States. Avoid eating lettuce because it could carry the virus and people have a mild stomachache due to the virus. But one bite of lettuce will not cause pain. The United States government is working on a cure at this time. Make your family and friends aware with the lettuce picture. And I used a similar content, but at this time for the fear-arousing misinformation, I used a different picture and also highlighted some of the words like fatal virus, deadly virus, and how many people have died to create some kind of fearful emotions to the audiences. So when it comes to the web add-on correction, I use the web add-on extension browser that I just shared to you guys before by simply labeling this misinformation as fake, which states that the story has been debunked and did not provide any alternative explanation. So this was just the correction that I used for each of the fear-neutral misinformation and fear-arousing misinformation. And for people who were assigned to the no correction condition, they didn't see any of this corrective information. They just saw the misinformation and that was it. So here are some of the simple results that I found in this research project. So I found that correction presence interact with misinformation type on susceptibility. So if you remember my suggested model before, I was interested in looking at fear and severity, susceptibility in terms of risk perception, but I could only find the significant results on susceptibility. And whether this susceptibility, I was also wondering whether this susceptibility further affects our misinformation credibility, and it turned out as significant. And all of these moderated mediation effects also turn out to be significant, which I'm gonna explain later on. So assuming that a lot of you guys are familiar with the term susceptibility, to just clarify, is a risk perception that we feel that we are at risk, right? It's a kind of personal risk perception. So whenever we see that health virus is spreading, people who have a high susceptibility will gonna perceive that they would likely be affected by the health virus. So it's not about the things that are happening on a macro level. It's some kind of like a micro level risk perception, as I can say. So when it comes to the interaction between the misinformation types and the correction presence on susceptibility, here I want you to just focus on this red box here. So again, this graph shows people who saw the fear-neutral misinformation, whenever they saw the no correction, whenever they didn't see any correction, they tended to have a high levels of susceptibility. So in other words, whenever they didn't see any corrective information, they perceive that they are at risk, right? And that susceptibility ultimately affected misinformation credibility at a higher rate. But this web add-on correction actually reduced the susceptibility compared to the no correction condition, right? So in this case, web add-on correction worked. And this differences was significant. However, those who saw the fear-arousing misinformation, there was no significant differences between the web add-on correction and no correction condition. So that means web add-on correction actually nullified the effects of correcting the misinformation, right? Especially if the misinformation is laden by a lot of emotions. This web add-on correction actually turned out that it actually didn't work, right? To correct the misperceptions, to reduce the susceptibility as well. So this was interesting because a lot of social media platforms and media professionals have applied a lot of media literacy interventions in a hope that correction and other media literacy interventions may work. But my recent project shows that it really depends on whether misinformation is emotionally laden. In other words, whether misinformation is perceived to have emotions, then correction in that case may not work, right? So not all correction may work in this case. So this research project actually implies some of the several kind of meanings here. Again, focusing on the susceptibility, we have to think that when people relate a health risk to oneself, they tend to just rely on misperceptions rather than focusing on the corrective information, right? So this kind of susceptibility is really a matter of concern that makes people to be more susceptible to misperception, make people to be more susceptible to misinformation. And another key finding here is that the arousing misinformation would be really difficult to correct. And like I showed before, from the real world examples, a lot of misinformation social media posts that we are seeing these days are actually emotionally laden. So here again, if this kind of emotionally laden misinformation is difficult to be correct, then the next question that we have to ask is that what should we have to do, right? How we should better design the corrective information, how we should better provide media literacy educations to the public in order to counter against this emotionally laden misinformation. That would be a huge question that has to be addressed. So similar to the argument that I just made, a simple refutation of this web add-on correction may not be an effective tool to counter fear-arousing misinformation, right? So you may start wondering whether alternative explanations like providing a lot of scientific evidence or some other kinds of media literacy educations may work if simple refutation really is a matter, right? That nullify the effects of corrective information. So that could be certainly addressed in the future research because overall, my findings suggested that the one-size-fits-all approach may not be effective because simply just labeling the false misinformation as false may not be effective, right? Especially for the emotionally laden false information. So overall, this research project again highlights the argument that negative emotionally laden misinformation is something that we have to study further because it has been not actually examined a lot in previous literature. So we have to think about how misinformation has been differentiated in terms of emotions and whether the corrective information may work in some misinformation or other misinformation or all of the misinformation. So given that people more rely on social media during health crisis, then some of the scholars have actually asked a question that, should we have to make people pause to think before posting any other things or making people engage in social media conversations? Well, actually, these are all great questions, I can say, because actually making people to engage in accurate information can be a important and something valuable actions that we can do, right? But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that, unfortunately, social media interaction itself about talking about all the health risk can increase the misperceptions as seen in my recent projects. So the question is not all social media interactions, not having always people engage in social media interaction may not be effective. So perhaps the most important question that we have to think about is how we can plan corrective actions, how we can make people engage in corrective actions instead of simply providing the corrective messagings, instead of simply making people to be engaged in social media interaction, regardless of the topics that we're going to discuss. So in part two, I actually wanted to expand these kind of findings into the AI-enabled deepfake, artificial intelligence-enabled deepfake. So in other words, this project actually dealt with that, how this deepfake about health risk can provoke our emotions. And if this deepfake provokes our emotions, how people ultimately perceive this misinformation, how people ultimately perceive this deepfake, and whether they become more susceptible to this deepfake. So like I briefly explained about the deepfake concept, again, it's a face swapping tool, but deepfake has been also applied a lot in terms of facial manipulation. So this facial manipulation also is something that, we're creating some kind of fictitious character, fictitious person that never exists, right? So the face swapping is like just face swapping between the two different existing people's faces, but the facial expression is creating a fictitious character, fictitious avatar, I can say, which is very similar to the person. So when we think about these kind of features of the deepfake that has been created through the artificial intelligence, then people may be more susceptible to this kind of deepfake because it actually seems to be real. It actually seems to be similar to the real person, right? But from a theoretical understanding, we need a more thorough, I can say, like understanding how people are, in what ways people are becoming more susceptible to this deepfake, right? So I wanted to approach this issue using this multimodal framing theory and realism heuristics, and in addition to that, from an emotional approach. So to just briefly explain about these concepts, multimodal framing theory actually indicates that people are more persuaded by the information that has a lot of different cues, like a combination of audio, visual, and text versus the other messages that is only provided by the only one cue, like either text, video, or audio. And the realism heuristic, which I'm going to explain also later on, is something that is argued by seeing is believing. So again, if people sees that this video is real, it seems to be real, then they just believe it, right? And all these multimodal framing theory and realism heuristic commonly argues that it really matters for us to have an easier processing of multimodal information, and using this multimodal information also directly affects our behavior intentions. So to move forward, to explain a little bit further about each theory, multimodal framing theory is the combination of images and text highlight a salient aspect of an issue and elicit a stronger impact on the audience. And this multimodal framing theory also argues that we tend to process the images, we tend to process the videos with a faster and automatic processing versus we tend to process the text based on our slower and controlled processing. So these kind of theories argue that whenever we see the visible images, visible video, we just quickly process the messages. So we really we tend to process that messages through our heuristic cues. And similar to the multimodal framing theory, realism heuristic also relates to how we process the multimodal information, because it also argues that if something seems real, then it seems to be credible. So all of this theory commonly argues that vividness is associated with the audiovisual modality, and this vividness may be a key for us to process the content in a heuristic manner, right? But I also realized that there has been a lack of research on how this vividness is also related to our emotional processing, or whether this emotional processing also further affects our susceptibility to all this kind of misinformation. So briefly, to briefly just introduce my recent publication, our team has an interest in how people process the deepfake first, right? Before moving on to the emotional processing. So we created two different deepfakes for each topic. The first one, drug legalization, and the second one, abortion, which are all very sensitive and politicized topic. And we used two different persons' faces like this. The one, economist Jeffrey Millen, who is known to be very favorable toward the drug liberalization. And the other one, Senator David Perdue, who is also known to be a very conservative in terms of drug legalization. So we face swap these two different faces and create a deepfake like this. The same thing happened for the abortion. So we face swapped the actress Mila Jovovich and actress Margaret Collin, who are known as having a very opposite stance about the abortion. And we also created a face swap deepfake by face swapping this Margaret Collin's face onto the Mila Jovovich. So what we wanted to examine here in this project is that we wanted to compare between the text-only fake news, text photo fake news, and the deepfake news, right? And we was interested in examining how people process this deepfake news through which mechanisms. So the key finding here is that we noticed people really cares about the source vividness heuristic, right? In other words, if they see either text photo fake news or deepfake news, they tend to just focus on the source presented in this news article. But this kind of source vividness didn't happen for the text-only fake news. In other words, if people saw this fake news based on the text-only cues, they actually didn't notice that much about the source, so they tended to pay much more attention about this fake news content, and that really matters for them to have a better discernment about the truth and fake news content. But again, people who were assigned in a deepfake news, they tended to just pay attention to the source vividness, and they just perceive that this fake news is correct, this fake news is accurate. So here are the specific results of each study. So in study 1, we also found that all the significant findings on the significant path from the text photo fake news to source vividness, and furthermore to fake news credibility. And same thing happened for the deepfake news when it compared to the text-only fake news, source vividness to fake news credibility. And not only fake news credibility, we were also interested in looking at how the source vividness further affects the fake news engagement intentions. In other words, whether they are having intentions to click the likes or share the content and other stuff. And we again found the significant effects on all these different paths. And then the same thing also occurred in the abortion issue. So we again found this very significant findings about the source vividness operation. So we wanted to expand this findings in terms of the other health risk. And in this case, we wanted to examine about the emotions. So here as a follow-up study, we did a similar approach. We used a deep learning approach to create another deepfake news. And in this case, the context was cancer prevention. So this deepfake video tells people that if you enjoy cold weather, you should know that drinking cold water after a meal can cause cancer, right? And we just showed the audiences that this is stated by Dr. Shara Jones at the World Health Organization, which is absolutely false. And we asked our research assistant to create a video stating the false statements and just face swap these persons, doctors' faces onto our research assistant faces. So our main goal here was whether this kind of deepfake news causes fear and anger. So again, we did a very similar approach by creating the text-only disinformation, text photo disinformation, and text video disinformation. And we first wanted to examine whether the disinformation exposure itself causes fear and anger, and whether this fear and anger further affects our misperception. And model 2 was more related to the multimodal disinformation. So in this case, we compare between the video text, image text, and text, and whether these all different types of disinformation affects fear and anger, and whether that also affects misperceptions. So to just go right away about the findings here, first about the model 1, which simply compared the disinformation exposure, we found all the significant results. But the interesting thing is that anger actually reduced misperceptions, but fear increased misperceptions. So again, this goes back to my original argument that not all emotions may cause misperceptions, right? So we interpreted this finding in terms of the aspect that anger may indicate something that people might have an anger toward the misinformation, right? Anger toward the disinformation. But fear in this case, if people are paralyzed by fearful feelings, they would probably have a higher misperceptions. Regarding the second model, which was more related to the multimodal disinformation by comparing video text, image text, and text, we found a very interesting results because we found that compared to the text, video-based deepfake news increased the fearful feelings, and these fearful feelings further increased the misperceptions, but it actually didn't affect the anger emotions. So we can overall argue that video-based deepfake news can paralyze people to capture by their fearful feelings, and this fear further make people to be susceptible to misperceptions. So the overall implications about my multimodal disinformation research projects is that multimodal disinformation is actually causing a lot of problems when it comes to the health risk, because people may simply rely on source vividness, and people may also rely on fearful feelings. So those, all the heuristic cues may just decide what they should believe, right? What they should have beliefs and misperceptions. So this kind of source vividness and affection, like emotion, can operate as a realism heuristics of processing disinformation. So perhaps the next question for our future research agenda for emotion and misinformation about health risk can be a numerous thing, I can say, right? So when it comes to the emotion and technological development, we may have started to think about whether just having people to be regulated by emotion may be the best answer, or maybe provoking some kind of emotional feelings, or amplify those emotions, like amplify the anger toward the disinformation, or making people to be talking about this misinformation and having an angry feeling toward each other, maybe a kind of possible solution, maybe a feasible solution for us to better counter the misinformation, can be an important question that we all have to think about. And finally, we have to also think about whether technological affordances really matters here in terms of provoking emotions or regulating our emotions. So again, going back to our overall implications, we may have to start thinking about the different roles based on the different distinct emotions, and how people talk about, how people have an interaction with others by provoking emotions to others, or by captured by all the fearful feelings. So whether those, all the emotions really matter for us to process the misinformation and disinformation. Yep, so that was pretty much about it, about my presentation, and I would like to send a special thanks to all of the collaborators. So that was pretty much about it. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I look forward to having more discussions.
That's fantastic, Dr. Lee. Thank you so much. I apologize for missing the beginning portion of this presentation. I was caught in a meeting, but I'm glad that the talk went very well and fascinating stuff. So I want to make this seminar really informal. So if you guys have any questions, you can raise your digital hand, and you can, tell us what your questions are, or you can also, put your question in the chat box, right? So we have about 13 minutes or so. So you guys have any questions, just, either raise your hand or put it in the chat box. Really, really interesting stuff. So we'll just wait for the question to come in. When so I had a really I had a reaction when you presented the finding about the emotional message that was debunked, and also the non-emotional message that was also debunked. Did you, it seems to me from the figure, the graph you presented, that is there a main effect, for the non-emotional message that had induced even higher susceptibility to misinformation? Because when I was seeing that graph, it seems like the non-emotional message with the one that has only the letters seem to, without the correction the susceptibility to the misinformation, I suppose it's a measurement of belief or in perceiving the risk and that type of response that was actually higher than the one that's resulting from the emotional content. Did you see any statistically significant difference, or was that just presented in the sample?
Yeah, that is a great question, I can say, because you pointed out a very important thing in my recent projects. What I did in that experiment was I showed the misinformation first, either non-emotional or fear-arousing misinformation, and then right after that, I just show the corrective information. So I randomly assign participants to no correction and correction conditions. And after all the randomly assignment, they had to answer about the susceptibility. So I can say that, you know, susceptibility is not a main effects of fear arousing or emotion neutral misinformation that didn't see any correction. It actually has a mixed conditions of all the you know, correction presence, like no correction and corrective information. So in this project, I didn't, you know, specify the hypothesis of the main effects based on those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you didn't observe any main effect?
No, no.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thank you very much. So I think Ali has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Xiaoli, and thank you, Jiyoung, for this wonderful presentation. Very fantastic and timely. So I just have a curious question related to your first misinformation correction paper. So in addition to fear arouser misinformation types, have you tested other types of emotional aroused messages, such as those misinformation that can provoke our anger, anxiety, and frustration? And if you have, are there any intensity differences in terms of their arousal or effects? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Ellie. So that's kind of interesting question, but in this project, I just focus on the fear emotion only and didn't examine the other emotions, and also didn't, you know, specifically divide it into the different levels of emotion, different levels of fear based on its intensity. But I certainly see that, you know, intensity and distinct emotions may also matter of concern. And you know, given that my experiment that I presented before was about the health virus, I thought that the fear has a pretty much, you know, relation to this topic. But absolutely, when it comes to the anger, like, you know, delegitimizing all the medical experts, or, you know, giving a harassment to all the other people would absolutely cause anger, right? So it can be certainly, you know, examined in the future projects, I can say, right? So intensity and distinct emotion is always something that we can, you know, we can examine in all the different projects. So that's an important question.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Are there any other questions from the audience? Got a really quiet audience today. So Jiyoung, this is really fantastic. Talk to us about your future research agenda. I feel like you're launching into something that could really become a really productive kind of helpful program of research and relevant. So what do you see yourself like in 5 years? Well, this is not a job interview, but I'm just curious, and obviously the research you're doing right now is very interesting and kind of cutting edge. So where do you see yourself in 5 years, and maybe you know, what do you see in 5 or 10 years? This research on misinformation, a lot of us are very interested or doing a lot of research going on right now. So do you see what is the future trends you're looking at right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can say that I'm having a kind of a dream to making people have a critical insight into how they can use the media technologies for better informed citizenry, right? And that's a very broad question, but I think this is a very crucial question that, not only myself, but all the other communication scholars who deal with this area should also, start thinking about it, because we all know that artificial intelligence, like augmented reality, virtual reality, are always being emerged, is always advanced, and technological advancement will continue to grow. But it's not something that we are chasing all the technological advancement, right? We need to better understand how we can use as having a user agency. And in terms of that, this deepfake research project is actually touching an important thing, because I started to think that artificial intelligence create another severe issue, makes a lot of people, vulnerable people, to be more susceptible to misinformation. And when it comes to the health misinformation, it's getting more serious. It can directly affect their health behaviors. So how can we better counter these, AI developed deepfake, which is kind of different version of the misinformation as well? And how we can also use this artificial intelligence to provide, to spread a more kind of accurate information, to have a more accurate understanding of the all societal issues going around. So emotions in that sense is kind of the key concept that I always keep in mind, because it can explain a lot of different things that that is happening in people's mind in processing the content. But definitely, like, something that how people perceive and how people can use all the technological advancement to become an informed citizenry is kind of key question in my research trajectory, I can say.
Fantastic. That's awesome. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, so I think you've been doing some really interesting work, like on AI, social media. The Facebook changed their company name to Meta. And do you have any thoughts about what that means for misinformation and health behavior change? Like, we're all interested in health communication. Do you have any thoughts about that? And what kind of world is that metaverse going to introduce us to? Yeah, does that kind of click with some of the work you're doing about deepfake and that kind of thing? Because when you're in the metaverse, I suppose you probably, a lot of the deepfake problems or even opportunities can be intensified. So do you have any thoughts about that? Maybe not, but it's, I'm just curious.
Yeah, certainly. That's a great question as well, because one of the ongoing project that I'm doing here at the UA is by using augmented reality and virtual reality, we have examined how people can better understand about the health information and risk information. So how the Facebook has been changing their name and their direction certainly matters a lot in changing other people's health behavior, I can say. But the more important question that hasn't been addressed much in our scholarship is in which situations that these VR, AR may work in helping people understand the health information, right? Like just giving the virtual reality technology and then just letting people use it is not sufficient, I can say, to expect people to change their health behavior. Anyway, like people were gonna consume the news article, people were gonna consume the information. So kind of the question that I had a particular interest in is in which situation and which information that these AR and VR and other mixed reality technologies can be better integrated so that it can eventually affect people's accurate knowledge, helping people build up the accurate knowledge. So, traditional media, like combining the traditional media and all the different things are evolving in terms of mixed reality can be something that we can have a specific and larger interest in that area.
Yeah, that's I think one thing you mentioned in your presentation that, I mean, we got a lot of research going on about correcting misinformation, correcting misperceptions. One of the things that you mentioned is that one size does not fit all, right? I mean, it's I think it's a principle like in health messaging, in any kind of persuasion, is that you cannot use like one kind of intervention to like across the board for everyone or for any kind of issue or for any kind of messages. And I think that is it's a very good point, as we invest more in misinformation correction. Like we're all kind of rushing to this one direction, but not knowing the issue can be a little bit more complicated. As you highlighted, there are different types of misinformation. Some has emotion, some does not have much of the emotion elements. And so correction or mitigation of those kind of misinformation has to be guided by the sort of the specific features of the information. So I think that's a very good point. And it's insight for all of us who's in healthcom and who are doing work on misinformation, knowing that it's not one size fit all, although it's kind of a long-standing principle in persuasion, but somehow, like, as this misinformation problem arises, we feel like, oh, we're gonna do this, we have to do the misinformation correction or fact checking. But like, wait a minute, let's look into this and figure out what's the best approach in a particular situation, right? So, well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Lee, for presenting today. And it was fantastic research. And we wish you the best luck in your future research and other endeavors.
Thank you so much for having me again. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe you'll come back later in the future, when you have other more research going on, and we can invite you back.
Thank you so much. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.